What the hell is even that?
If memory serves, the hardest games I've ever completed are God of War 4 on Give Me God of War, The Last of Us Part 2 on Grounded, and Dark Souls 2. Lies of P makes these AAA greats look like Dora. This South Korean Metroidvania offers most of what one would expect from a solid high-budget game. Good graphics to set the mood, a dramatic soundtrack to focus players, meticulous dungeon design full of shortcuts, different ways to upgrade or customize your character, the works. The game's manageable dungeons don't suggest how nearly impossible the bosses are. Every boss will make you want to quit. Only as you approach your 10,000th death will you accidentally deliver a coup de grace after memorizing a moveset for hours or days. Upon release, critical reception to Lies of P was positive, and personally, the parrying mechanic made combat look like Sekiro with different aesthetics. In spite of being a blatant attempt to one-up From Software, Lies of P isn't bad. It's just impossible and deeply frustrating. I acknowledge Lies of P is a successful game. Though I struggled to enjoy the first dungeon and felt frustrated by the overall experience, I recommend Lies of P to an especially resilient audience for the following reasons. Before combat, traversal is the aspect of the game that most closely resembles that of From Software games. You can walk, run, or leap across dungeons full of elevators to activate, shortcuts to open, ladders to climb, and ditches to investigate. Almost all movement is planar, as Pinnochiro is as sensitive to fall damage as any protagonist in Dark Souls. Despite mostly planar movement, the 19th century urban environment invites substantial verticality into each dungeon. There are plenty of opportunities to run into traps, items, and secrets. The most immediately noticeable difference is that Lies of P gives you a lot of stamina from the get-go. Everything from dashing and leaping to blocking and strong attacks barely makes a dent. There's almost no incentive to invest in more. At first, combat was unsatisfyingly arbitrary. My attacks carried no weight, and parrying was impossible. I felt like I was playing Dark Souls with everything good sucked out of it. However, to rectify this, I needed only to learn which attacks were worth parrying rather than dodging. Dodging is easier, but parrying rewards you with critical strikes. If you parry enemies enough times, they become stunnable. You can use a charge attack or weapon art to unbalance them, and you can score a bloodborne critical strike once they're down. Dodging small common enemies and learning to parry large unique enemies was most useful for me. The more menacing the enemy, the greater an impact parrying has. But parrying remains more difficult than dodging, so you need to choose your battles. Beyond core fighting mechanics, enemy diversity pulls most weight in terms of making combat fun. In part, this is because they excel at communicating how difficult they're going to be. Large enemies are always more difficult than small enemies, whereas From Software games sometimes do the opposite on purpose. The three major categories of enemies are puppets, carcasses, and humans. Puppets are vulnerable to shock, carcasses are vulnerable to acid, and humans are vulnerable to fire. Explicit use cases encourage players to work elemental vulnerabilities into combat strategies. Bosses are as important as a Souls veteran would expect them to be in a game like this. By far, they're the most satisfying enemies to dispatch, but they're as insanely difficult as the dungeons are manageable. Overall, Lies of P is much more difficult than any From Software game, due to the former's outrageous bosses. There are many items and abilities you can use to make bosses easier, including a summon, a free elemental power-up, and a substantial arsenal of throwables. Tapping into most of this assistance is like using a band-aid to fix a broken spine, so you're better off parrying as many attacks as possible. Bosses are annoying on a cosmic level during the first playthrough, but they become a lot more manageable later. If I could do it all over, I'd invest in Vitality first, because being able to get hit a bunch made a huge positive difference during my second playthrough and beyond. There are three primary ways to expand Pinnochio's abilities: character levels, courts, and gear upgrades. Character levels work as they do in From Software games. Experience points have a silly name, ergo. If you die, you have to obtain your experience points where you've died, but the character levels in Lies of P are much quicker in comparison to From Software games. By the end of your second playthrough, 2 stats will be at or near the cap of 100. Also, if a boss kills you, your leftover ergo waits for you at the fog wall, so your experience points are a little easier to hang on to. Finally, there are items you can apply that can keep you from losing your ergo upon death. Quartz is a rare collectible that you can apply to advance Pinnochio's utility. It's not all about damage or defense. With Quartz, you can only advance Pinnochio's abilities in particular ways. You do eventually max out this tree, rendering the item useless, but for the first 3 playthroughs, its effects make it highly valuable. You can find quartz among the remains of difficult enemies, or in faraway corners of Krat. With regard to gear upgrades, boss weapons and regular ones have their own upgrade paths. One material upgrades regular weapons by 10 levels, while a more valuable material upgrades boss weapons by 5 levels. Other materials can change weapons' attribute bonuses as well. Pinocchio's prosthetic arm comes in 6 useless flavors, though I recommend the shield. It can be effective if you're in a pinch and don't feel like dying. Finally, cosmetics and genuine armor function independently from each other, so you can equip whatever outfit looks cool. There are a variety of outfits to unlock throughout the game. In fact, these costumes are probably my favorite items to collect. Playthrough after playthrough, Lies of P becomes much easier as Pinocchio strengthens. There's something strangely addicting about making mincemeat of bosses that had obliterated you days earlier. The only caveat is that you massacre enemies because you're superficially stronger, not because you're better, though memorizing boss movesets can hurt. Also, the game presents the usual From Software trope of multiple endings to increase replay value, but you needn't worry about an ending that bars you from certain content. There's no Shura ending, in part because the game is Korean and not Japanese. I can see that endings are more like achievements, since the game's narrative is little beyond out-of-context references to the actual story of Pinocchio. Lies of P is fun enough to rival the games it copies, but it doesn't have much more to offer outside its exorbitant difficulty. I would only recommend it to someone who has either finished every From Software game multiple times, or someone who seeks a greater challenge. Though I was initially resistant to completing the game, I finished it multiple times, ultimately unable to pull myself away from it, so it's done something right. All that positive press can't be wrong. As long as you understand that Lies of P is likely going to be the most difficult single-player experience of your life, by all means partake. Don't lie about the same thing all the time, and I'll see you in maybe 11 days.